originally this block was a block of the day, 0828, August 28th, last year of 2023. So if you want that original video, you can scan this and that will take you to the original video. The Squiggle block you can make in two different sizes, 4x8 and 6x12. The quilt I made is 6x12 inch blocks. Here are the 4x8 inch finished blocks. There's only 2 patches for each, half square triangles and squares. These are the measurements for 6x12 inch finished block. The original video gave you instructions how you can take scraps of jelly rolls and make the 4x8 inch block. So you might want to check that out if you want to use your jelly roll scraps for this instead of fat quarters. The larger blocks were better for fat quarters, I thought, and it's kind of scrappy. The two different layouts you can use are, this is side-by-side squiggles, or these are alternating squiggles. They kind of look like waves, which I like this design. Later on in the video, I'll show you how to piece the block and then how to lay these out in both of these configurations. And here are the easy piecing instructions. We just make half square triangles, then put the block together. Here's a diagram of the quilt I made. It finishes 66 by 84. There are 77 blocks, and like I said, they're the 6 inch by 12 inch finished blocks. And they're set 11 across and 7 down, and it's the alternating set, so they look like the waves going across. Here are the fabric requirements for this quilt. I used fat quarters. I started to make a really scrappy quilt, but it just got too tedious cutting all those different pieces, and so I just thought I'll just use fat quarters. I can cut them faster. You'll need 20 background fat quarters and 20 accent fat quarters. And this note here tells you from each fat quarter, each set of fat quarters, you can make 4 blocks. So you only need 77 blocks. So 19 background and 19 accent fat quarters will get you 76. So the last one, if you don't want to cut up another fat quarter for just 1 block, you can cut from 2 different fabrics, the background and the accent. You can cut 1 strip at 4 inches times 18 inches. That should get you enough for 1 block. So that way you can save your fat quarter. For the binding you need 5/8 yards, and for the backing you need 5 yards. Here's a diagram of how I cut the fat quarter. This is the 21 inches, this is the 18 inches, and we cut across the 18 inches. So these 2 strips, we cut 3.5 inches, and these are for the squares. Then we'll subcut 4 squares here and 4 squares here, so we need 8 squares for the 4 blocks. And these 2 will cut 4-inch squares for the half square triangles. And this is for rotary cutting. So these 2 strips will be for the half square triangles. So you'll cut squares that are 4 inches and cut each in half diagonally if you're going to sew the patches, or if you're going to sew 2 at a time half square triangles, you'll keep them in squares. And you'll see that later on in the video. A lot of people ask me to talk about pressing, so here is how I pressed these. For this one, I decided, since I was alternating the blocks, I wanted to make sure I had some nesting seams where I could. So I pressed in this direction. So I sewed them together in rows. So I sewed these 2 together, then I pressed toward the square. I sewed these 2 together and pressed toward the square, and then repeated those down here. I always pressed toward the square. And then when I sewed this first and second row together, I pressed toward the inside of the block, toward the center of the block. I did the same thing here, pressed toward the center of the block. And in the center seam, I pressed it open because I didn't know which direction it would go. Since I was putting them in alternating sets, I didn't know which direction the seam line would go, so now I just have 2 open seams stacked on top of each other. So here's a block, and I'll show you the pressing. So here I press toward the square, toward the square on all 4 of these. Then I press this one toward the center and this one toward the center, and I press the center seam open. And that seemed to work really well because I can nest these 2 seams, and this usually fell on top of another one, another pressed open seam. And when I sewed the blocks together, I pressed those seams open as well. I want to show you how the fat quarters were cut. So here is a fat quarter. This is the selvage, so this is 21 inches. And for rotary cutting, you can fold it in half like this. So I would start here and start cutting. First I'd cut a strip for my squares, then cut another strip for my squares. We'll cut 4 each, so that'll be 8 squares. Then we'll cut 2 strips again for our half square triangles. If you're using some other method to make the half square triangles in this section here, like if you're using papers or something else, then save that section. And you'll have, for the AccuQuilt, I had about 5 inches left here. And I'm using that to cut for another scrappy quilt. For AccuQuilt, I folded the same way, but I pressed this. I pressed this right here because it was really close to the size of my die. And then I folded it again and pressed it. So I have 4 layers of fabric. These are the 2 dies I use. This is the 3-inch finished half square triangle. This is the 3-inch finished square. Now I don't think I paid too much attention to the lengthwise or crosswise grain because you're cutting basically a square, so you're going to have lengthwise or crosswise either way on either side, so it doesn't matter to me. So I took this and the selvage I had on this side. Now I've got 4 layers and it fits just like this on top of this die. And I have my markings around it, so I'll know that as long as I stay in the markings, I'll cover all the blades on the die. So I cut this, and then I came back, and this side here, I just laid that next on there again. And so I had my 2 sets of half square triangles. And then next, I took my square die, and wherever I was on here, I just placed it on this, ran it through, cut 4 squares, then took the edge here that was cut, placed it on here, and had 4 squares. And this was the extra I had, about 5 inches, 5, maybe 6 inches extra. Because you can get really close to these blades and you don't have very much waste at all. So that's how I cut the pieces with the AccuQuilt. I used these 2 dies. This is from the 6-inch cube. So let's look at what we have here. Here's our patch A, which are the half square triangles. If you're cutting patches, you'll simply put 2 together like this, flip this over, and you match all 3 sides, stitch 1/4 inch, and press your seams open, and you will have 4 half square triangles. So we'll do those. Now we have our 4 half square triangles made. If you prefer to use the 2 at a time method, stay tuned for a short tutorial that shows you how to do that. On the back side of the light fabric, we're going to draw a diagonal line, put the fabrics together, right sides together, and we're going to stitch on either side of the diagonal line. Here is the diagonal line drawn, and then the stitching on both sides. Now we cut this in half along the diagonal line. Then we have our 2 half square triangles, press the seams open, and cut off the nubs. Next we just follow the diagram, follow this diagram to put the block together. And I used, for my backgrounds, I used low volume prints. And then you simply put these together. I stitched these 2 together, so I stitched 4 rows, pressed the seams, and then stitched the rows together. We're just going to stitch these together and these together because I want to show you how to do the offset layout. Here are the 2 pieces, and if you'll notice, They're exactly the same. You just flip them over and that's what you get. So we're going to leave these separate right now. Here are some other blocks I did. And if you were setting these block to block, you would just sew them together like this. Sew them into rows first and then sew your rows together. Also, if you don't want to use the same fabric for each block, you can go scrappy. You can say do a green block with all different kind of greens, blue, red. You can do it that way, but I just chose to do it one fabric with all of them. This is how you do the side-by-side layout. If you want to do the offset layout, you'll take one of these and you'll piece it halfway like we did here. So here's how it would be. We're going to take the bottom one and put it at the top. And then we'll take a full one and finish off with full ones. So you can see they're offset. If you reach the bottom here, you would put that's the bottom, so this will be the top. You would put this one like that. You can see it. And then you do a straight row like this, and I would piece these in vertical rows. Then your next row would be like this. It would be the bottom part goes at the top and the top part goes at the bottom. And that's how you lay those out. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.